You're listening to This Week in Cardiology from theheart.org on Medscape.
Hi, everyone. This is John Mandrola with theheart.org Medscape Cardiology, and this is This Week in Cardiology for August 3rd, 2018. This week, I'm talking aspirin dosing, a new drug in electrophysiology, possibly, apixaban in patients with end-stage kidney disease, TAVR, and sauna bathing. Few dogmas in medicine are more ensconced than that of low-dose aspirin, or baby aspirin, as we call it. I mean, almost everyone, patients and doctors alike, default to the notion that low-dose aspirin is enough to prevent cardiac events, no matter the size of the patient. Of course, we like to minimize aspirin dosing to limit its NSAID-like effect on cyclooxygenase. So therefore, we dose a 400-pound man the same way as we would a 95-pound woman with low-dose aspirin, because as the thinking goes, just a little aspirin is enough to block platelet function. Findings of a recent meta-analysis of aspirin RCTs that was published in The Lancet challenges this one-size-fits-all dogma, and it challenges it in a big way. The researchers, mostly from the UK, combined individual patient data from 10 trials of primary prevention aspirin therapy, including well more than 100,000 patients, and they were looking specifically at the effects of body weight on aspirin effects on outcomes. And they found, provocatively, that the ability of 75 to 100 milligrams of aspirin to reduce cardiac events decreased with increasing weight. And there was benefit seen in patients weighing below 70 kilograms. The hazard ratio was 0.75, but they did not find the same benefit in patients weighing more than 70 kilograms. Now, this is an important observation, as most people in the Western world who take aspirin for primary prevention weigh more than 70 kilograms. And the authors checked their observations in numerous ways. One was to confirm the findings in trials of secondary prevention, and they found that the results held up. And another way they confirmed their findings was to check for aspirin-mediated reductions in colorectal cancer, and again, the protective effects of aspirin depended on body weight. Also, the results held up in men and women and those with diabetes. Another provocative finding from this meta-analysis was that cardiovascular death was actually increased, odds ratio 1.33, in patients on low-dose aspirin who weighed more than 70 kilograms. Now, there were some unusual patterns in this paper. One was that higher doses of aspirin had the opposite interaction with body weight, namely it reduced cardiovascular events only at higher weight. And actually, this is kind of one of the study's weaknesses. For instance, why should high doses of aspirin not be effective in smaller people? Also hard to explain was that bleeding risk on low-dose aspirin was elevated in patients who were 70 to 90 kilograms. Now, on the one hand, this study suggests we could be making a huge public health error. Although the absolute risk reduction of aspirin is small per individual in terms of primary prevention, millions and millions of people more than 70 kilograms may be taking aspirin at low dose and getting no effect. But on the other hand, some very thoughtful academics, especially on Twitter, question the validity of this analysis. They say there are hard-to-explain effects that are going in implausible directions. Now, what we can say is that this study should certainly increase our uncertainty about aspirin dosing. Interestingly, later this month, 2 RCTs looking at low-dose aspirin in primary prevention will be presented at ESC, and we'll certainly cover those. Well, finally, this sort of findings should prompt further studies looking at the weight dependence of antiplatelet drugs. This is a huge and important clinically relevant issue. Second topic today is a new drug for supraventricular tachycardia may be on the horizon. And new drugs in EP are rare. This new drug is called etripamil. It's a novel, nasally delivered calcium entry blocker. It has verapamil-like effects. A phase 2 study published in JACC found that it was pretty good for acute conversion of SVT in the controlled setting of an EP lab. Now, depending on dose, and remember, phase 2 studies are for dose ranging, the conversion rate with etripamil was 65% and 95% versus 35% in the placebo arm. The investigators didn't find any significant adverse effects with the drug. Now, we still need more data, but I would welcome this new drug for SVT, and here is why. Not all SVT need be ablated. I mean, once you talk with patients who have SVT, you remove their fear of the problem, explain the situation to them. People who have infrequent episodes of SVT could avoid the small but real risk of a procedural complication by simply having a nasal puffer on hand. What's more, I would love to see etripamil replace adenosine in ambulances and emergency rooms. I use adenosine very sparingly. I call it the heart stopper. It's a rough drug. It requires a big IV, a big flush, and it causes people to feel terrible. And of course, it sets them up for ablation because they feel so bad from the adenosine, they don't want to have it again. Adenosine is really the antithesis of minimally disruptive medicine, and I would welcome a nasally delivered drug that could terminate SVT without significant complications. The third topic today is apixaban in patients with end-stage kidney disease. What I'll start by saying may sound overly simplistic, but it bears noting, and that is, patients with end-stage kidney disease present special therapeutic challenges. What works in people with normal or only mildly impaired kidney function may not work in patients with significant kidney disease. And one of the toughest questions in cardiology and nephrology is how best to prevent stroke in patients with advanced kidney disease who have atrial fibrillation. These patients were not included in the RCTs of warfarin versus the DOACs, or direct-acting oral anticoagulant drugs. Thus, we are left with only observational data. Now, dabigatran and rivaroxaban in large part cleared renally, and so they are not used in patients with end-stage kidney disease. But apixaban is less renally excreted, and surprisingly, FDA has labeled full-dose apixaban as okay in patients on hemodialysis. And FDA bases this labeling on pharmacokinetic data. Well, this week, researchers from the University of Michigan, publishing in Circulation, set out to study contemporary use of apixaban in patients with AFib and end-stage kidney disease, and to assess the utility of apixaban versus warfarin. Now, to do this, they use the Medicare database, taking patients on apixaban and comparing them to patients taking warfarin. The technical name for this kind of study is a retrospective cohort study. Now, of course, this was not a randomized comparison, so the authors did their best to match patients in the warfarin and apixaban cohorts. They used a form of propensity matching called the prognostic score, and they ended up with about 2,500 patients who took apixaban and 23,000 on warfarin. They first reported a steady increase in the prescriptions for apixaban in patients with end-stage kidney disease over recent years. So in other words, more doctors are doing this. And in the matched cohorts, they found no difference in stroke or systemic embolism in the apixaban versus warfarin arm, so they looked equivalent. But apixaban associated with lower risk of major bleeding. Now, intracranial hemorrhage was about the same in both groups, 3.1 and 3.5%. And note that that is much higher risk of ICH than seen in the RCTs in patients with normal renal function. Remember, I said that patients with kidney disease are special. Another interesting feature of this study was that about half of the end-stage kidney disease patients got standard dose of apixaban and half got the 2.5 milligrams BID, so that allowed them to do a secondary analysis. In the secondary analysis, the 5 BID dosing versus warfarin associated with a reduced stroke rate, but the 2.5 BID versus warfarin did not reduce stroke. However, major bleeding was reduced in both doses of apixaban versus warfarin. And then when they looked at just the apixaban groups, they found that the standard dose versus the lower dose of apixaban associated with lower rates of stroke and death compared with the reduced dose, and no differences in bleeding. So my comments on this paper is that this is a well-written paper, it's nicely done, and in the absence of RCTs, observational studies are all that we have to go by. But it's super hard to make any firm conclusions on this sort of evidence, mainly because of confounding variables. Did the apixaban group have fewer strokes because of the drug, or did healthier patients more often get apixaban? You can't say this from this kind of observational data. What's more, and this is a most crucial point, we don't even know whether anticoagulation is beneficial in patients with end-stage kidney disease with any drug. There is an ongoing RCT called renal AF, and that will pit apixaban versus warfarin in patients with end-stage kidney disease, but sadly, its primary endpoint is time to onset of major bleeding, and stroke will be a secondary endpoint. Also, this renal AF trial will not include a placebo arm. We need that placebo arm to know whether any oral anticoagulation is beneficial. And as pointed out in our nicely written news story, about 2/3 of patients in each group were no longer taking any anticoagulation after 12 months from the original prescription. So again, end-stage kidney disease patients often have to stop anticoagulant therapy. Next topic today is TAVR. Now I'll start by saying in American healthcare, CMS, or the Center for Medicaid Medicare Services, is king. He or she who pays the bills makes the rules, and that's why it's big news when the Medicare Evidence Development and Coverage Advisory Committee met to hear input from experts and professional societies regarding policies for having a TAVR program. Now, TAVR in the U.S. is now under a very strict NCD, or National Coverage Decision, and this NCD is under review. And one of the more contentious points that was discussed in this meeting was the setting of procedural volume requirements. Some experts who testified to the panel felt that there should be volume requirements, say 50 TAVRs per year, and their argument goes, TAVR complication rates in the U.S. are decreasing, and most TAVR is done in high-volume centers. Thus, we should have that requirement. Other experts, however, disagreed. They argue the evidence tying volume to outcomes is weak, and closing low-volume TAVR programs, or not allowing lower-volume programs from starting, would limit access and exacerbate already stark inequities of care in the U.S. Now, this discussion made news at our hospital because we fall just under the discussed volume cutoff. And I highlight this topic because it relates to the issue we have with AF ablation, very similar. Despite the fact that the number of AF procedures are increasing, complication rates remain steady. You would think complication rates would decrease as the number of AF ablation procedures increase. One reason offered for this lack of improvement with more procedures is that most AF ablation is done in low-volume centers. That's different than TAVR. So in the U.S., even small hospitals want to have AF ablation programs because they make money. When I visited Canada, I saw something different. I learned that procedures such as TAVR and AF ablations are done only in major centers. People I talk with at these Canadian centers, who practice at those centers, feel this is the best way to assure patient safety. Now, I fall more along the Canadian model. It makes sense to do these procedures in specialized centers, but Americans love liberty, and our culture is to minimize barriers to entry in a marketplace. Now, finally, I have to mention the concept of moral hazard of procedural volume requirements. Don't tell me the requirement to meet a certain procedural volume will not impair the decision-making surrounding suitability for TAVR, especially at centers that are at risk of not making the cutoff. The final topic today is about saunas. In the winter, after a great workout, it feels good to sit in a hot sauna. The sensations you get feel healthy. So, of course, it also feels good to drink coffee, eat blueberries, and chocolate. This does not mean, though, that these behaviors alone produce health. A recent review, notably a non-systematic review published in Mayo Clinic Proceedings, tout the many benefits of a Finnish-type sauna. Now, here is the key sentence from this lengthy paper. Quote, the available data are made of mixed evidence from mainly uncontrolled and small intervention studies conducted several decades ago and observational study designs, which are limited by potential biases such as reverse causation and/or residual confounding. My friends, I mean no malice to lovers of sauna baiting or to the authors, but that these sorts of studies get published in journals and then covered by media creates the potential of harm via distraction. When a proper RCT comes along telling us that the transient nice sensations you feel in a sauna translates to real health benefits, I'm all ears. But adding flawed observational studies together does not make them better or get us closer to causality. Rather, this stuff distracts our attention from things that actually do produce health, like eating a good diet and exercising regularly. So that's it for this week in cardiology. I'm grateful that you listen. Thank you. This is John Mandrola from the Heart.org, Medscape Cardiology.
You're listening to This Week in Cardiology from the Heart.org on Medscape.